Hey there. I'm excited to announce this to you today. This is what you've been waiting for in your spiritual quest. This is something I've wanted to do for a long time, and I'm finally ready to announce it that it's ready to go. It's the Grief to Growth Community Circle. Now, this is a sanctuary where like-minded souls are united in their journey through grief and towards personal transformation. It's more than just a place. It's a beginning. It's a commitment to growth and understanding. Here you're finding not just a community, but you're entering a circle of trust and depth. You're going to engage with interactive coursework. You'll dive into exclusive podcast episodes and partake in discussions that illuminate the path from mourning to empowerment. This is a realm where every question is honored and every individual's journey is validated. To be part of this exclusive circle, visit us at grieftogrowth.com/community or look for the chat icon at the bottom of every page on the main website. Remember that entry is a privilege because I want to ensure that every member is as dedicated and genuine as you are. You must apply to join, but the journey within is worth every step. So go ahead and join us today. Check it out, grieftogrowth.com/community, and I look forward to seeing you there. Hey, everybody, this is Brian. Welcome back to another enlightening episode of the Grief to Growth podcast, where we talk about the transformative journey of the human spirit. As I said, I'm your host, Brian. Today, we have an extraordinary guest whose life experiences echo the essence of transformation, of resilience, and of compassion. Please welcome Matthew Brackett. He's an executive leadership coach, a diversity and inclusion trainer, and a resiliency expert and advisor. His journey began in the small, closely knit communities in New England, in a New England town, and propelled him to international service in various forms. He's lived all over the world and done some really fascinating things. Matthew comes from a large family of 13, which is a household that served as the initial classroom for his life's wisdom. Today, we're going to touch on many topics. Some of the things I want to explore with him are the cornerstones that give our lives shape and depth, how change and crisis are integral to our human journey, the transformative power of pain, and the value of sharing your experience to lift others up. We'll explore Matthew's insights into navigating the complex territories of self-hatred and depression. We'll discuss the importance of practicing compassion and empathy in a world that often lacks both. If you're finding yourself standing at the crossroads of indecision, or we often call sliding, or what Matthew calls sliding, not deciding, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about why self-awareness and emotional intelligence can be your compass. And if you've ever wondered about the purpose of life's challenges and crises, today I think we'll offer you some insight into that. Matthew has served in various capacities, first through religious ministry in countries like Italy, Ireland, England, Colombia, Chile, and Mexico. And later, he was a staff officer and chaplain in the U.S. Navy. So he brings a rich tapestry of experiences to our conversation today. And his life's mission has been steeped in the commitment to facilitate human development and growth. So with that, I want to welcome to Grief to Growth, Matthew Brackett.
Thank you very much, Brian. So great to be here to talk about all these different topics, topics that are part and parcel of our human experience, but oftentimes difficult to talk about.
So yeah, that's kind of what we do here. We don't cover the easy stuff. We like to jump right in and talk about the things that shape our lives. That's so right. My first question for you, you came from a small town in New England, and now you're an international figure in leadership coaching and resilience. So was there a pivotal moment that set you on this path or to explore pain and grief?
Oh, well, there's a lot there in that question. Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, small town New England, as you mentioned, and I appreciate that you mentioned that. My family was the first classroom, right, where you learn about life and being a big family, a large family, learn about generosity, about service, about sharing, about community. And then I suppose why I went into, as I look back on my story, why I went into formal ministry. I think part of it was looking for something, but part of it was also running away from other stuff. Probably not the greatest motivations to do what I did, but they were what they were, mm-hmm. and I don't regret it. It's brought me to who I am now. But I think part of it was, running away from small town New England, from where I just probably didn't find myself. And growing up, I suppose growing up in a large family, you can get a little bit lost in the mix. unintentionally, but this is just, that's sort of what my experience was. So it was sort of, then I went on a journey of, I got to find myself, and I wanted to do something important. Growing up in a faith-based family, and I wanted to do something transcendental, something that had a lasting impression, not only in time, but also in eternity, right? I wanted to do something meaningful for people and to serve. And I know that's something that you talk about in some of your podcasts, is really to the beauty of service and generosity and giving. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that's what led me then to formal ministry. And then after a few decades, realizing that it wasn't the right place, some people are like, well, it took you a long time to figure that out. But anyways, well, I guess we live our life to the answers. And I suppose there were years when I resisted. I didn't want to, look at the obvious, maybe. And so I just tried to make it work. Mm-hmm. And so that led me to, going back to your question about why do I do what I do now, because I'm very passionate about the human person. I'm passionate and in love with the beautiful complexities of our human experience. And why leadership? Because leadership, the use of authority, the use of power, the use of influence will always has been and will always be part of our human experience. And when it's done in a healthy, wholesome way, it's very life-giving. And when it's done in an unhealthy way or a dysfunctional way, it can be very destructive to who we are as human beings. And when that happens in faith-based organizations, or when that happens in family, the destruction touches deeper fibers of us, of who we are as human beings. So it's part of the human experience. And I think there's as human beings, we're always going through crisis. So there's a crisis of leadership and crisis of authority in around at least the Western world. I can't speak to other parts of the world. And I think there's just so much to do. And when I speak about leadership, I speak about this holistic approach, sort of how, first and foremost, how I lead myself. And this is sort of where our topic fits in. Mm-hmm. And then how I lead in my inner circles of influence, whether it be relationships, family, and then how I lead in professionally, and how I lead in organizational contexts. All of those have sort of different aspects. They're sort of different perspectives of what leadership is. So that's why I do what I do. That's the approach. And why grief? I think, but part of it is I've been really fortunate, not fortunate to see people go through grief, but fortunate to be invited into that sacred space of people's lives, of people's pain. When we're in ministry, we oftentimes share the highest highs and the lowest lows. Mm-hmm. And so to step into that space, to walk with many people was a very meaningful place to be, and to experience our human sensitivity, fragility, and and all the everything that we can go through when we go through grief. And then in my own personal life, I can't say that I've had very significant losses as regards to death, because oftentimes when we think about grief, we think about death, but as we'll get into, there's so many other types of losses that we can go through as human beings, and the process ends up being very similar, because whatever it is, something was ripped away from us, or we slowly lost something, and it leaves a hole, a wound, or whatever we want to call it. And so then how do we reconcile? How do we integrate without covering that up? And how do we honor that hole, or that space, or that wound, and find meaning in continuing to go forward? That's the great challenge in all of this. So in my own personal life, one of the losses was going through what I go as having to confront my life and make the decision around leaving ministry. Mm-hmm. Because there's a whole thing around identity, around expectations, around the way I thought and sort of hoped things would be, and where that is no longer there, and I have to recalibrate, reconsider, put everything on the table, and make decisions that are very difficult. And there's losses that come with that decision. Now, of course, there's so many gains as well. And that's why I don't regret where I'm at and the decisions that I've made. Maybe I some regrets around how some decisions I made going through life, but who doesn't have those? Right. But trying to do our best to make it all right, and then it makes sense, and to make it meaningful.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey there, something I want to tell you about today. My podcast platform, Buzzsprout, has recently made it easier for me to allow you to support me financially. Go to www.grieftogrowth.com/subscribe. That's grief2growth.com/subscribe. And once you're there, you can sign up to support me financially. Now, you can do it for as little as $3 a month or, of course, as much as you'd like. If you do that, you'll get access to bonus episodes, and you'll see those in the regular feed. They'll have a lock on them. But when you become a subscriber, you'll actually get access to your own private feed, and you'll be able to listen to the regular podcast along with the bonus podcast for the subscribers. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for sharing the podcast. And I want to thank those of you who support me financially. Have a great day, and on to the episode. I would imagine, as you said, I love you talked about the fact that grief isn't only around death; it's around any type of loss. And some people might be going, "Well, is it really a loss if you made the decision to leave the ministry, right? This was your choice." But there's still, as you said, there's the giving up of the identity, and I think especially in something like a ministry where you feel like it's a calling. So I can imagine that was a painful process for you.
Yes. No, definitely. I think it's a loss of identity. Identity is really important for us as human beings.
Mm.
And oftentimes, naturally, we look for identity outside of us. Not the healthiest way to find our identity, but something that we do as human beings. And I became part of organizations that had a very strong identity, and where you wear a uniform, whether it be in the Navy or whether it be in priesthood. And then you have titles, and there's very clear hierarchy. And so that becomes a place we find security in that. But then when that's taken away, we're left sort of swirling and trying to figure things out. And sometimes as grief, the one way of explaining grief is the unfinished hurt that is swirling around in the spirit, and trying to understand it better, make sense of it, and to discover ourselves in the process. And when we face pain, when we face crisis, when we face grief, oftentimes we want to silence the pain because pain is not comfortable for us as human beings. So there's something in us that we know that pain is sort of the pain and discomfort. We know that no pain, no gain, whatever, all those different phrases that. We go to the gym, we experience pain, but because there's a goal, so pain is something that is hard for us, sort of like that. It's just a conflictive sort of topic for us as human beings, where we know it's important and that there's so much value in it, so much wisdom in it, but at the same time, we don't like it, and so we try to avoid it. And that can happen oftentimes with grief. And I think I did that, having to face my own decisions. I shut that part down for a while because I didn't want to have to make those difficult decisions.
Sure. So I could being in a faith-based organization, being in the ministry, being in the priesthood, being a chaplain, and seeing people go through pain. You must have gotten this question thousands of times. Why? Why would God allow this? Why did this happen to me? How do you answer that question?
Yes. The perennial problem of pain. So many people have written about it, going back to just the ancient authors of Greece and Rome and all that. So, and it's just gone on. It's and it's the problem that every generation asks itself. Mm-hmm. And whether it be from the human perspective or in the faith perspective, why, if, all these things, if God is so good. So there's a few ways that I answer it. And I want to begin saying this is a phrase that I really want to knock this out early on in this conversation. There's a phrase that says everything happens for a reason, right? Which, in working with the Marines, and the sort of all these free, very easy phrases that we use, that when we go deeper or when we use them in the wrong moments, they're very offensive or hurtful. Right? Not everything happens for a reason, right? Or a lot of things can happen for very bad reasons, or bad or poor decisions of others. And I'll get to the answering your question in a second. But I think that the challenge of us, and I think that in the beauty of the human spirit, is that we will never be able to say that this thing happened for a reason, but we can find the reason to keep on going, and we can find meaning in overcoming what has happened, or in integrating, or in reconciling, or in allowing that to offer me some momentum to get to a new place in life. But we have to be very careful, and just using that phrase with people as a sort of as a very lazy consolation phrase. Everything, no, not you can't say that to someone that's lost a loved one in an accident, got hit by a drunk driver, killed by a drunk driver. Can't say that to someone who's been abused, either emotionally, psychologically, sexually. You can't say that, sitting with a Marine who's lost his brother, in a gang fight, and he was holding his brother as he had gotten shot and he dies in his arms. You can't say that. Everything happens for a reason. But the greatness of the human spirit is to find reason to keep going. And I think in your story, if you have a daughter, and that is no longer with you, but you speak about her in the present because she is with you. But again, we can't say that all that happens for a reason when you go through that. But to find meaning and purpose in the tragedy is, I think, something very beautiful in the human spirit. No, now let's get back to answering your question. So how do I answer that question about God? If God is so good, why did bad things happen to good people? Or the problem of pain? The way I look at it is, first of all, it's a very oversimplification, right? God gave all of us the gift of free will. He gave us intelligence and he gave us free will. And we can use that free will for good and also for bad. And I think that the greatness and the beauty of the human spirit is that a human that freely decides to love and to do good, something so beautiful. So if we didn't have free will, we couldn't do that. Now, what's the downside? What's the shadow side of having free will? Is that we suffer the consequences of bad decisions or evil decisions of others, of a very bad use of free will of others. And so we could say, well, if God is almighty and God is all powerful, why doesn't he? Well, precisely because, yes, he is God, but that would take away our free will. If God, inserted himself in the way, he created laws of nature, God created laws of the universe, God created laws that we have as human beings. And so God is respectful. And I think we want to have a God that is very respectful of us. Respectful of our space, and that God won't interject himself. And so that's how so it's really not, it's not that God allows or sends us pain, or that God allows us intentionally to go through pain. God allows us to exercise our free human will for so many wonderful, great things. But sadly, we also use it in a very poor and destructive way. And we have to benefit from the goodness and suffer the consequences from the bad.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot with that question, but it's one that we get when people come to us when they're in grief and they're in pain, and often that's a point where people's faith fails them, frankly. Because they've been taught this very simplistic view of God. God's like the Santa Claus God. Right. If you do good things, then God gives you good things. And if you do bad things, then God gives you bad things. But what happens when I do good things and then bad things happen? That doesn't line up with that type of faith.
Yes. And then when something bad happens, then of course you have there's anger, there's rejection. And then the very negative side of teaching faith like that, it's overly simplistic, as you well said, right? And it doesn't really serve people in the long run and of the bigger picture of life, because then something bad happens and you don't know what to do with it, and then it creates anger, it creates rejection of God. And how many people, and this isn't often spoken about how many people, because of just the poor way we teach our faith, how many people have rejected God, right? In other words, the opposite of what we look for in organized religion. We've, by poorly managed, the teaching of faith and the dealing with people, we've created the opposite reaction that really we're looking for. And that's tragic. That's very sad.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hi there. I'm really excited to tell you about my latest ebook. It's 4 lessons that you can learn from the near-death experience without going through all the trouble of dying to learn them. I've been studying NDEs for several years now. I am completely convinced that not only are they 100% real, but that there's some very universal wisdom that we can get from the near-death experience. And I've distilled that down in this book into 4 short lessons. And I've also given you all the reasons why I believe that NDEs are absolutely real. So go to www.grieftogrowth.com/NDE lessons to pick it up for free. www.grieftogrowth.com/NDE lessons. I hope you enjoy it. It is very sad. And, and speaking of religion, and we're kind of going off of what we were planning to talk about today, but I think it's really important, this time we're going through. We're recording this in October of 2023 when Hamas is just in the name of religion attacked and murdered and tortured and unspeakable things to Jews. Right. And I saw someone post the other day, the Holy Land is supposed to be peaceful, and it's the most violent place on earth.
Right.
So it's really hard to reconcile that with what we teach God's supposed to be.
It is. When people look at so much violence in the name of religion and so much harm, whether it be in any type of denomination, it creates a lot of conflict in the human mind. Like, wait, this is a huge contradiction. This is not making sense. And that's why I think nowadays, in the younger generations, there's a huge rejection towards organized religion. And there's this typical phrase a lot of people use: "I'm spiritual, but not religious." I mean, I use the words interchangeably. For me, I think the human person is, as anthropologically, we are religious beings. In other words, we tend towards something bigger than us, where we are transcendent beings. So I think that people use them, but I think we are religious and we are spiritual. And I use those 2 words interchangeably because there's something in us that longs for something more that's transcendent. But then there's a rejection towards organized religion, because of the contradictions and hurt and harm that is found in organizations. It's the human side. But again, it's sad because it doesn't reflect good on really the truth of who God is.
Yeah, well, the distinction you made, or you said you use the words interchangeably, and I think what people are saying when they say I'm spiritual but not religious is they are rejecting that as you said, that organized aspect of it, that aspect of that divides us, that says that Muslims and Jews should hate each other, which is just the most ridiculous thing ever, and goes so much against what God is. And I was just on a board the other day, and we were talking about religion, and someone said, okay, when people have near-death experiences or what is the one true religion? People always want to know what's the right one. And I made the comment, when Jesus wasn't a Christian or a Muslim, or and this guy goes, oh, Jesus was a Muslim. And I'm like, okay, so 500 years before Muhammad, Jesus was a Muslim. But it's really interesting how we tend to divide ourselves up over a concept that should bring us together.
We do. As human beings, we want a sense of belonging. And then there's something in our psychology, human beings, that when we become part of something, then we want like a tight-knit group, and then so it's like it's us against them.
Yeah.
And that happens. Sadly, that happens. And then there's a lot of any religious group has some extreme tendency, some extreme party or group that goes to the extreme. And we see this in Islam, we see this in the Jews, we see this in Catholics, we see this in a lot of Christian, you said you were part of a fundamentalist group. So we see it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard. And sadly, I think it has its roots obviously in ideologies, but also has its roots in some charismatic figures. And this is where we get into one aspect of leadership is, there's certain human beings, and it's so interesting, that have this, I don't know, it's sort of this magnetism, right? This sort of charisma about them. And it just brings people toward them, and they use it in a very harmful way. But charisma oftentimes, I don't say always, but oftentimes, if not kept in check, it's linked to some sort of personality disorder. And that's why it's dangerous because when you have charisma, then people give you so much power, in these extreme groups, and then that power is used eventually against you, psychologically, mentally, spiritually, sometimes sexually. So
Yeah, that's really interesting observation, because it does seem like a lot of times these, I guess it's a chicken or egg thing. I'm thinking about it. It's like, do they rise to that level because they have a personality disorder, or is it because of the attention that they get and the power that corrupts them, or and why are people attracted to that? It's really interesting. It's really fascinating to me.
it is. That's probably a topic for another day. But yes,
Yeah.
it is interesting.
So when it comes to leadership, I mean, do you help people recognize that in themselves and keep it in check? Because it is a problem, I think, in all kinds of organizations. And we mentioned earlier, it's not just political. It's in corporations. It's in families even.
It is. Yeah, it's in families. It's in corporations. It's in organizations. It's everywhere because it's part of just who we are as humans. Now this I'm not. Yeah, you tell me how much we want to go into that. I think go just a simple answer. And can you rephrase the question?
Well, I'm thinking, as we come into leadership roles,
right?
how do we recognize that in ourselves, keeping ourselves in check? I think about even in the church, in the church, not my particular church, but in the church, a lot of times pastors,
right,
they go crazy.
Yes. So I think keeping it in check, sadly, I think people that have these tendencies are not interested or disposed to work on themselves.
Hmm.
So that's the sad thing, because again, it is about creating this awareness, right? And a lot of the work that I do there's two types of service, around individual coaching, accompaniment is just so powerful because it forces people to slow down in their life and to pay attention to what's going on inside of, to pay attention to intentions, to pay attention to motivations, to pay attention to values, to needs, all these other things, and to shed light on a lot of the blind spots. And so that's one. And then the other thing is offering conferences, workshops, things that help, in a group setting to also offer education and to create areas of personal reflection around some of these things. And sadly, when people that might have some sort of personality disorders, and charisma and power all linked together, might not, there's a lot of blindness, and so and I think an inability and unwillingness to look at certain things. So
yeah,
not much you can do, but it's interesting, as you said, how people like that gain so much power and are given so much power by human beings. I think we all look for people to look up to, and we look for people to lead us in a meaningful direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why this happens. And we can get wrapped up into that net, that web.
Yeah.
Because it's always painted as a good thing.
Yeah. You're right. We tend to want to put our power in someone that says they're going to take care of us.
Right.
They're going to be our savior, for lack of a better word. So we give our authority away. Mm-hmm. I do want to kind of, switching gears, go back to, because you mentioned in your bio, and we talked about a little bit, you grew up in a family of 13 in a small town, I guess. What was that like, and how does your role in that family organization, how does that shape who you are?
I was the 10th of 13. We've since both of my parents have died. My mother died in 2013. My dad died in 2021. So being the 10th, being on the younger side, mm-hmm. You're raised by your older siblings in certain ways, right? And I think it becomes community. It becomes our home and my parents were very intentional about making our home a place, sort of a playground, a discovery land. They got a few acres and had a house and bought animals and their idea was, let's make this a place where all of your relatives and friends want to come rather than our children always looking elsewhere to find the entertainment in where to spend their time. We also worked from a very young age. And back in those days, that was just the normal thing to do. At 8 or 9, my mother, we got us jobs at strawberry fields or at orchards or wherever. Also cutting grass, shoveling snow, all the normal stuff. Teaching us to, again, as you said, as a school, as a classroom, to learn about life, learn work ethic, learn responsibility. The parents got animals, not because we really had a farm or lived on a farm, but it was all about teaching the children how to be responsible and to take care of things. And so it was, early morning before going to school, walking through the snow, changing the water for the chickens, bringing in the ice, defrosting everything and filling it with fresh water and bringing it out, and then doing the same thing in the afternoon after school during the winter. All that was just part of, my parents were very intentional about what they were trying to do with us. So there's a great beauty in that. We never lacked anything, but we also never had any luxuries, no trips or vacations or things like that. It was, I think, but I suppose the downside, if we're going to talk about it, is every big family is different and every personality is different. So I think sometimes people maybe feel like you're getting lost in the mix. My parents were, grew up in the Depression and also grew up in families where they didn't receive a lot of affection. And the emotional side, I think generations have changed as regards emotions and all that. Our parents were very distant, and I think we experienced that, and that had different consequences on children. So that's the short answer to that question.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you sharing that. And because you're all of our lives, I think everybody's life is interesting in different ways. And we talked earlier about, like, do things happen for a reason? And that is certainly debatable, but we can always find reason, or we can find meaning, in it. And a lot of times those things in our early life, they do drive us, even though sometimes we might not realize till later how they've driven us. And to be a person who's lived, you've lived all over the world. Literally many different cultures, and you live in this great life of service. So it's always interesting to get to know someone's background and maybe how that influenced them.
Sure. No, it definitely does influence us. And I think as adults, it's kind of also this coming to terms with certain things, reconciling certain things about our past. It's not about, a lot of us, because of who we are as human beings, we can shift to the blame mode, pointing fingers. I have all these problems because of this person, that event. Yes, but we don't gain a lot from, just playing the blame game. It's natural that we do that as human beings. But in the end, we have to take responsibility for our lives.
Yeah.
For who I am, for where I'm at.
Well, we talked earlier, and I think it might have been before we started recording, you mentioned, like, we both have religious backgrounds, and, religion can harm us sometimes, but I believe usually it's unintentional, whether it's coming from our parents or even from some of the religious leaders. Like we talked, there are some crazy leaders in some churches, but that we can choose whether we want to play that blame game, or whether we want to learn and grow from it. And obviously you've chosen the latter. That's, you and you're helping other people to develop,
right,
to reach their potential. So I think that's a fantastic thing.
Thank you. I have tried. Doesn't mean I have those moments where I go into victim mode, or I can point fingers and feel bad about myself. But yes, but it's working through that. And I think it's also, this has so much to do with the work that you do around grief. Around, whatever the loss is. Fact is, now I'm experiencing it. Now what do I do? We all get it. We can all spin out of control going through that. But it's little by little gaining control again, and making the best decisions. When we're in crisis as human beings, or when we're in pain, oftentimes we can shift to very impulsive decisions, or we can make very poor decisions naturally, because we're trying to get out of the crisis as soon as possible. We're trying to get out of the pain. But oftentimes those decisions aren't in the bigger picture of life. And so, one of the topics I enjoy talking about is being patient in pain, so that we can really, whatever the loss is, to learn how to sit with it and to discover the answers as we go through it, rather than trying to jump out of it. But anyways, that's such an interesting topic.
Yeah, well, and I think that you had a phrase that I noticed in your information to me about sliding, not deciding. I think it was. What does that mean?
It's more about just not being intentional. We can, whether it be because as human beings we have a hard time with difficult conversations, or we have a hard time facing the truths about our life. It's easier just to kind of, let's just see what happens, go with the flow, whatever. The easiest example to use is relationships, where we can slide into relationships without having all the intentional conversations about where we're at, where are we going, and all this, right? And then we stay there for an undetermined amount of time. And then that can lead to, depending on, if you get married, it just leads to, well, we slid into this, we really never decided, right? Or we can slide into a lot of things in life and then just stay there because it becomes a comfortable place to be.
Mm-hmm.
Comfortable, but also uncomfortable. We're not like, this doesn't fit, this isn't right. But I suppose it's easier than change.
Right.
Change is hard for us as human beings as well. Our brain has a hard time with change. We want safety and security. And so we can oftentimes find safety and security in the known discomfort and pain rather than stepping out of it.
Yeah.
That's sort of the simplest way of without giving a lot of examples around sliding and deciding.
Yeah, it's interesting as we talk about this. I was just meeting with a client earlier today who lost someone very close to them, and they're coming up on like the 2-year anniversary of it. And what I was observing with this person is like how quickly, relatively speaking, they're progressing through what they need to go through. But it's because they've done all this work. It's as you said, it's intentional. And when it comes to the grief process, I hate to say this to people, but it's work. It's a matter of setting intentions and doing the work. So your phrase "sliding, not deciding" makes perfect sense because we avoid the uncomfortable stuff. We're like, let's just put it off. Let's not think about it. We don't like change. We don't want to change ourselves. We don't like when things change around us.
Right. Yes. It's natural. And it happens to me every day. I avoid projects. I avoid work, right? Sometimes I avoid difficult conversations, because you don't know how to, but in the end, those are like little clouds that we carry around that become heavy.
Mm-hmm.
And so intentionality is so, and, when we talk about personal growth, it's, none of us go uphill unintentionally. Right.
Right.
We can go downhill unintentionally, right? But growth, if we use the hill example, growth, and all that in development, it requires intentionality. It doesn't happen by inertia or on its own. And in this context about working through grief, it requires a lot of intentional work of leaning into the pain to draw the wisdom and to understand and to reconcile with it, to integrate it. And so that it doesn't have so much power over us, to integrate it and reconcile it in a very healthy way.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard for us, and that's why, and I think in the whole thing of loss, it's, people turn to other types of behaviors. They want to just silence the grief, not deal with it, and then move on. But when we do that as human beings, at some point, especially if it's something that was very important and meaningful, it will, I suppose, life will send us a bill.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be pretty expensive. And this has a lot to do with my story of not dealing with my stuff, letting it build up and build up. I use this example a lot working with Marines. Is we put certain events in our life or certain emotions, we put them like into a little cupboard or closets, into the darkness, hoping that when we put them there, they'll just sort of disappear. But there's certain things, experiences, emotions, things, that when we leave them in darkness, they grow.
Mm.
And at some point they can really take over. And when I say that they grow, they sort of can go bad, they can fester. It begins to affect our whole, even though we can't see them yet, but the stench of that is affecting my whole life, and my whole ambient, my environment. And then I give this off in the way I am. We don't know where it's coming from. Well, it's stuff that we haven't really dealt with in the healthiest way. But it's natural for us as human beings that we want to put those things away because they're very uncomfortable. We don't know there's certain things that happen to us that we just don't know what to do with them.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes we don't like to reach out for support or help. Right? We like to manage things on our own. And so, well, I'm just gonna, and in my life as a priest, because of what you represent and in ministry, as a leader and as a figure, and you're supposed to have it all together. I'll be like, well, I can't be having these problems. I don't know what to do with it. And then I don't know who to trust with my pain. And I saw this a lot working with sailors and Marines because they're in an environment where where we have to be strong, and weakness is not an option. If I have problems, that means I'm weak, and weakness is unacceptable. So therefore, all my problems, I have to put them away.
Yeah.
Put on this facade. But at some point, that again, it sends a very expensive bill that we have to deal with at some point. And so that's what I did. I had to go into inpatient care for a good number of months to really deal with all the stuff that I was going through, my crisis, my identity, and very hard, very painful.
Yeah.
But it's led to, it's still a journey, but it's led to beautiful things. And I'm very thankful.
So how do we convince people, or how do we let people know that dealing with your stuff is actually a sign of strength, not weakness? Because I hear you talk about the Marines, and I just get this stereotypical picture of a Marine in my mind. But it's not just Marines; it's a lot of us.
All of
it's
us.
like I'm going to be strong. I'm going to power through this. I'm going to distract myself with whether it's with work or with whatever it is. But to deal with this, to reach out and get help, that's weakness.
Yes. Well, it's pretty, as in the human experience, we still, in the spectrum, we live in this tension between these extremes of there's something in us because of the ego, right? And the ego it's a necessary thing in our life. So I don't want to condemn the ego, but the ego has this certain aspect of independence. So I don't need anyone. I don't need anybody. I can do everything on my own. And then on the other side of that spectrum is codependency, right? Which is another healthy. But in the middle is this healthy interdependence. I don't mean to go on a tangent, but when we look at creation, we look at every element and every aspect of the world needs each other. Air, nature, water, everything, the trees, the plants, everything needs, nothing subsists in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Right, except God. Right, but nothing, and if we look at the most useless, for lack of a better word, being that ever exists is the human baby, right? Because it is so dependent for so long, and I think there's such an important lesson in that, that about who, as human beings, that we need each other, and we see it at the beginning of life, and we see it at the end of life,
right?
And in the middle, we sort of go on this thing of I don't need anybody, right? It's very natural, but in the end, and I learned the hard way. I didn't know how to work on myself. I didn't know how to trust people, and I had to learn. But there's something about this right here, Brian, you and I, this conversation, this confidential, not that this is confidential, but the safe setting where I can talk to someone, because we are mysteries unto ourselves, and I discover part of that mystery, part of who I am, through your eyes.
Yeah.
But also through transforming my experiences, the painful experience, transforming them into words, I take more ownership of them. They become more real. And that's why oftentimes when we talk about things, we start crying. Because when I transform it into words, into concepts, and I say it, it becomes more real. And it creates, and the same thing happens with laughter. But it creates a very powerful experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to go on another tangent about tears, right? And when I and again, we'll talk about the Marines. It's easy because it's a stereotypical thing that
right.
I love Marines, and I can't, when I don't want to generalize, and it's just I refer more to the culture.
It's a culture, yes.
Right? And and I've talked about the same culture in the Catholic Church and in other faith organizations, and it's around certain identities. But when I left the Navy and working with Marines, I wrote a little poem, and part of that poem says, because this poem is called "The Tear of a Marine,"
Mm.
and it's part of it says, "A tear is a language so refined that words cannot make up their mind. The body and spirit desire to express. Struggling words only say less, and the timid tear says it all, as from your eye does fall." And so tear is a language, right, of oftentimes of what we can say. And there's a father of the church as well, Ephraim, from the ancient fathers of the church, that says, "Until you have cried, you don't know God." Right? Tears cleanse our eyes so that we can see better.
Wow.
But it's hard for us as human beings to cry. And I've been able to sit in that space, where the uncomfortable space of to watch people cry,
Yeah.
allow them to cry. And knowing that those tears say a lot more than any words can ever say.
Yeah. That's beautiful. And it's funny because I'll have clients sometimes that'll apologize for crying. And I'm like, don't apologize for that, because we need that release. And I love that you said that it's like a language that we can't speak in words. And when we allow ourselves that, we feel so much better afterwards. We feel cleansed. We feel relieved. There's something about crying that actually, it's like you're releasing something.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. And going back to what you said, why is that contradiction we experience of dealing with our stuff, we can experience as a weakness, right? Or going through problems, or I think this is part of going back to the ego, it's part of who we are as human beings. But it's a lie that we tell ourselves. And it really, we tell ourselves because we tell everyone else that it's courageous.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point.
We tell everyone, it's amazing. And we find it so admirable, but we also find it hard to do for ourselves, right? Because of something in us that experiences a weakness, because we all have masks, right? And we use different masks for different settings.
Sure.
And in all of this, dealing with the reality, it's taking off the masks and just sitting with, looking at the man in the mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something in us that says it's a lie, but that says that that's weakness. But it's about the expectations we have in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm supposed to be this, I'm supposed to be that, I'm supposed to be. It's something we tell ourselves, really, but we think that everyone else is telling us that too, although it's not true. But we're telling it to ourselves, and so we're letting ourselves down. And this goes back to what you said about compassion for ourselves. We let ourselves down, and that's really, I think, where we have the conflict in dealing with the truth of what we're going through.
Yeah. Well, I like we also said about the ego, because I think we have to be balanced when it comes to the ego, because there's a really seems to be a big trend to bash the ego. I want to get rid of my ego. My ego's terrible. It's got to go. I want to kill the ego even. And it's like the ego is necessary. The ego is here to protect us, but sometimes the ego gets carried away. And while we are in this world, and the baby thing is a great analogy. We come in, we're totally dependent. We go out, we're totally dependent. And in between, we think we're supposed to be strong and independent, but nothing in nature, and nature is here to teach us, nothing in nature is independent. And we're not, I depend on people to grow food for me, to provide water for me, to do the roads. We're all, that's part of being human. But we get lost. We get lost in that ego thing.
Yeah, so let's keep the ego in check, because there's something about, whatever word you want to use for it, but there's something, what I call the beauty of human brokenness. So this is brokenness about, there's something that's a little bit off in our human condition, but I think there's a beauty about it, and it's keeping that in check. And the ego, of course, is necessary. It's part of our identity.
Mm-hmm.
Self-esteem is all, everything is built around just a healthy ego of who we are. So yes, we have to be very careful about just the condemnation of that, but it's keeping it in check so that it doesn't get distorted and lead us to distorted behaviors.
Yeah. It's helping the ego understand what its role is, right? And us understanding what our role is. I know you teach, obviously leadership training, but you also do diversity and inclusion. So
Right.
explain to people, because some people are like, why is that important?
Yes. Now, I like to say I take a holistic and wholesome approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I get a lot, why is a white heterosexual, male, cisgender male, why is he working in the diversity, equity, inclusion? Well, because I'm going back to what I said at the beginning, I'm passionate about the human person
Mm-hmm.
and our dignity of who we are as human beings. And so I don't think I need to be of a certain color, skin, or sexual orientation, whatever, to be able to have credibility in the space.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's also got hijacked by certain ideological principles. So it can be, which in the end does not serve the human person. And so I think just my background, my education, my global and intercultural background, I think it adds a great rich. So really it goes back to dignity, the dignity of the human person. So why is diversity, equity, include? Because as human beings, part of our human experience is also we have natural prejudices, we have natural biases, we have natural blindness, and it's something that we all have to work on. And so, DE&I, it addresses this in a very intentional way.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, I don't think in the best way, but at least there's a movement there of intentionally addressing biases. It's part of who we are as human beings, but they are things that do not serve us well.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's blindness. And in the end, it takes away, and when it's about human relationships, it takes away from the experience of human dignity. And we see this, if we go back to in the American culture, the way we dealt with Black people, with African Americans. But we can bring this, we can visit every country in the world and see that there's racism, discrimination, classism, all this other, because it's part of the human experience, but it's not a dignified part of our human experience. We can do better.
Mm-hmm.
We can do better. And so that's why it's important to me. And when I think about DE&I, yes, it means diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Under the umbrella of belonging, because this is what really in the end, that's what we're looking for. We all want to belong,
Mm-hmm.
But I also use DE&I to say, it's dignity, equality, empathy, and I can't remember what the I is. But anyways, okay.
Yeah.
And DE&I, when it's not healthy, it's divisive, exclusive, and ideological. So we have to keep that in check as well.
Yeah, well, talking about our biases, we all have them, and it's interesting because you've lived in different cultures. So I've only lived in America, so I think of the ones that we think of in America. But I know you've also lived in Ireland, and I remember when I was a child, and I would see what was going on in Ireland at that time, with Catholics and Protestants, and I'm like, wait a minute, these are all white people that speak the same language. They're all supposedly Christians. And human beings, we'll find a way to divide over like anything, and you think if aliens came to Earth, they'd look at it and say, what is going on here? What is the problem? So these small biases that people might think are not harmful, maybe in our everyday lives, blow up into things like what we're seeing going on in the Middle East right now, right? You get people living right next to each other who, if they're looking at each other, they can't tell the difference who's who, and then they're killing each other's children. So
Yes.
it starts with the small stuff, but it also becomes the big stuff.
It does. There's really not much I can say there. We can do so much better as human beings. We consider ourselves, so globally advanced, or, whether it be countries or just as a society, we're evolving, we're so developed. But when we look at all this, and again, we can go to the Middle East, we can go to so many countries in the African continent, which don't get a lot of visibility in the news, sadly. We can go to different parts of Asia. We can go to probably just little inner cities across our country, where we see this, and where human beings, we can do so much better in the way we treat each other. It doesn't make sense, and it's very hurtful.
Yeah, well, so again, I think it's like you said, teaching people about the dignity of all human beings, and I think, focusing more on what we have in common as opposed to what what our differences are. And I know you're from New England. You've lived all over the world. You're living in Mexico City right now, which I think, it'd be really cool if more of us could experience other cultures, to see the commonalities as opposed to all the differences that we're taught about.
Right. And to see the difference, but to understand, wow, people are so different, right? And to value it.
Yeah. Yeah.
The way they look at life. And, because I would recommend to at least now that we're speaking to a lot of Americans, I would recommend every American they can't do it, but to live abroad for a period of time, even just months, because it challenges our own set of beliefs and values, and the way, because we look at everything through our own prism, cultural prism. We're like, no, there's so many other ways, and to understand why people do things the way they do, the traditions they have, right? And usually there's traditions that are a lot older than the United States, right? And so, and learn how to value those, where those come from, and even if they some traditions or perspectives could be sort of born from a distorted vision of the human, but they've been there for centuries, and to understand where they come from, why they exist, and why they're valuable to people. And I think when we go back to just speaking about conflicts around parts of the world, a lot of it there's just so much history there, right? Which a lot of us don't understand the cultural and in aspects of history that have been there, that have built up that hatred has grown over time in this, and rejection, and there's just a lot of history. There's a lot of history of hurt, and it's passed on from generation to generation.
Yeah, I've been trying to educate myself on some of the history, and it doesn't make it less tragic, but it makes it, I guess, a little bit more understandable. But it just, when I see people killing other people, we've got to find a way to stop that, regardless of whether this guy's brother had a fight with that guy's brother several generations ago. And some of it comes down to literally that. These two brothers went two different ways, and we became this tribe and you became that tribe. And now we don't even know why we're fighting.
Right. And I think, what comes to mind is parenting. Parenting is so important, because oftentimes these things are passed on from parents to children.
Sure. Yeah.
And a lot of, extreme beliefs, and a lot of just ideologies, and a lot of just distortions can be passed on in that way. Right. And when you're a child and you grow up in this environment, well, you're told this, you see this, well, that's what you're going to believe, and that's how you're going to behave.
Sure.
And if we want to change, well, I think we have to change starts in the family.
Yeah, I completely agree.
And in the way government, leads. Yes.
Yeah. Well, you're helping with the leadership. That's awesome. So, Matthew, we're coming to the end of our time together. I wanted to give you a chance to say anything that you feel like you didn't get a chance to say to the audience, and let people know where they can find you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much for this. I know we went in so many different directions, probably we didn't expect, but that's the beauty of these conversations. I just, when we talk about losses, again, there's so many types of losses, and not to go on for a while, but what I would call even just little deaths in our life, when we can lose hope, when we can lose meaning, and whether it be when a romantic relationship falls apart, when it's a loss of a job, when an event changes my career progression, and when it's a loss of identity, right? When it's, in the sexual, there's so much also in the sexual experience, when the loss of virginity, for example, but when it happens in a very unhappy situation or tragic situation, there's or there's, again, and I don't mean to get too much into the sexual field, but it just, even and it can happen a lot with women that haven't had fulfilled sexual experiences, and there's a loss there, for whatever reason, that women that have never orgasmed. I know you probably didn't go into all this, but or when someone's cut out of, when someone is cut out of your life, or you're cut out of someone's life, divorce, the loss of trust in a person, an organization, when your vision of life and expectation just falls apart, when there's a loss of health, when you're diagnosed with a condition, when you lose a limb, when you lose hearing, when you lose sight. And there's so many types of losses, and grief is all part of this. So I'm throwing all those out there so that your listeners understand that the grieving process shows up in so many ways.
Yeah.
In our human experience. So feel free to reach out. Feel free to follow me on Instagram, Matthew Brackett Official, also on Facebook, LinkedIn, Matthew Brackett, my website, brackettalliance.com. And a lot of service, a lot of my approach to leadership is around the human experience, how I lead myself. And this is where grief fits into that, right? And then how I lead in my inner circles of influence, how I lead professionally and in organizational contexts. Yeah, so you'll see that a lot of my content doesn't deal with just leadership, but just a lot of aspects of the human experience. And I also do some relationship work. If you're in a committed relationship, and you want to make it work, but it's sort of like you're in rough waters, then I also work with people so that they can really learn to love again, learn to see each other again. Because there's also losses that they've experienced in the relationship, and so that to help you make the best decisions as you move forward as a couple. So thank you, Brian.
Yeah, great. Thanks for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Likewise. Thank you very much, Brian.
Hi there. I hope you enjoyed this latest episode of the podcast, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. What questions came up for you? What did you like about it? What didn't you like about it? I invite you to visit us at growth2growth.circle.so. That's growth2growth.circle.so to continue the conversation with me and with other listeners. It's a space to sound off, to share reactions, and to go deeper into the topics from the show. I look forward to chatting more, and I hope to see you there.